Name is Joe Evinger.
This meeting is being recorded.
Hi, my name is Joe Evinger. Welcome to the Ashby Village Science and Ideas Group. Hillary Naylor and I help coordinate this group's events. All of our members have varied educational and work experience, and we all share one common interest, and that's science and ideas. We have about 50 members in our group and another 50 in our guest list. We meet the second Thursday of every month from 3 o'clock until about 4:30. We have a different guest speaker each month who speaks to us on a topic related to science and ideas. We rely on our group members and both of Ashby Village and of this group, and anybody who comes to give us new leads on new speakers. Besides our presentation today, I'm actively recruiting speakers for the coming months. In May, we have a member of the Golden Gate Audubon Society who's going to speak to us about the history of a local wildlife refuge and some of its resident birds. In June, I have a tentative yes from the director of SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and still working on getting him to commit, but I'm at least in touch with his secretary, working on that. I have a volcanologist who's ready to talk to us as soon as I set a date. Roger Newman, who spoke to us twice about ancient human dispersals out of Africa, has been very patient to hold off his presentation until this summer or fall, so he'll be speaking to us on that before the year is out, and several other speakers I'm working on. And we invite all members of Ashby Village to join our group, and anyone else interested is more than welcome to join. It's free. Today, though, let's get down to business. We welcome Irene Kuhn. Irene is a virologist and cancer cell biologist. She holds a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology from UC Davis. Her career has spanned academia, 23 years in biotech pharma, and 11 years at Lawrence Berkeley Labs. Today, she is going to speak to us on a very intriguing topic, how HIV/AIDS gave us COVID-19 vaccines. And with that, I'm just going to hand it over to Irene. Thank you, Irene, for speaking to us again.
All right. Hello, everybody. And I am pretty excited to let you in on a story that I heard in a keynote speak at a conference on cancer therapeutics that I attended virtually last November. And I really wanted to present this story because it reminds me, and I hope it will ring true for you, that when people really pull together on something and are persistent and can get big coordination on many levels, we can actually pull off some amazing feats. And I had not understood well enough that when my products go into clinical trials, exactly what it takes to get through a clinical trial. So it was a big learning curve for me to put this talk together. And I welcome your questions if there are parts of it that I have not explained well enough, et cetera. So with that, I'm going to start the share screen, and it'll take me a minute to get to that. Okay. And I think here we are. Is that correct? Okay, so, all right. That's not quite there yet.
Okay. Hi, so just so you know, what course is that for?
Okay. All right, so can everybody see the slide that has the title of the talk?
That's good.
Okay, great. Here we go. So I've put this as an American love story because I was so impressed by what we were able to do given our networks, our scientific community, our medical researchers, et cetera. And I think that especially in the darker times of Delta, this was a good project to be working on. So So I'm going to start out with just a really brief background about vaccine clinical trials, and then go on to talking about, try and bring us back to where we were when Wuhan woke us. Just was in love with W's that day, obviously. And then to talk about a very tiny amount of the history of how the AIDS crisis has affected our public health institutions, the FDA, the NIH, the NIAID. And to then go into what was new to me to learn last November is really who and what were the networks that were behind being able to pull together US government response to the pandemic, in spite of the misinformation and disinformation that we were all bathing in. And then I will end with how the election affected the scientific integrity of those trials, or didn't, whatever. So this is a graphic that I pulled off the internet, and just explaining what a typical vaccine trial looks like. And there's obviously the exploratory preclinical work that's done in animal models. And for those of you who heard my first talk with this group or saw my YouTube on the internet, the mRNA vaccines had been well along in preclinical testing. And so they had spent their 2 to 3 years in testing there. Similarly, the other platforms that were brought to bear on COVID-19 were similarly already through preclinical. But what is the normal trajectory is that the phase 1 clinical trials, which are where healthy adults are inoculated with the vaccine, that can take 2 to 3 years to complete that trial. And it's maybe less than 100 people that are involved in the phase 1 clinical trial normally. Phase 2 clinical trials is trying to get an idea of an effective dose, not by exposing the person to the disease, but rather by testing their antibody response to the vaccination to determine whether or not a sufficiently robust antibody response was elicited by the various doses. And so if you're familiar with the Moderna vaccine, for instance, those of us who were vaccinated with it got was 100 micrograms, and the phase 2 clinical trials was 50, 100, and 250. So normally in a vaccine trial, that phase 2 clinical trial would take another 2 to 3 years before it's completed. And then we come to the phase 3 clinical trial, and those are hundreds of people in a normal vaccination clinical trial to thousands of people. The most of them that I'm familiar with had maybe 5,000 people in the phase 3 clinical trial. So there's another 2 to 3 years to get that work done. And then we're going to ignore the rest of it for now, the approval process and manufacturing and post-marketing surveillance. So 10 to 15 years is the average amount of time that it takes to get from the bench into arms. So that number up there, the phase 3, where my red arrow has come to, that is a big deal to figure out how many people is sufficient to get the kinds of data that you need, and to try and keep the costs down and the work of recruiting people into clinical trials. That number is worked on steadily and assiduously by biostatisticians to figure out how many people are really needed. Okay, so that number of people in the phase 3 clinical trials, which are the ones that we're going to focus on today, is something that, as I said, has to be set before the clinical trial is approved and can start. And when does the trial end? So the trial ends, that is, the data becomes unblinded. So you learn who got sick and what was the treatment or placebo that they were given. When they hit the number that the statisticians set beforehand, that's the end of the trial. So the confidence in the results is the primary endpoint or goal. And as I said, if you have a large number of volunteers, you're likely to get more people who are actually getting the disease, which is the endpoint in vaccine trials. And so the time to complete the trial, the speed of the trial, is a direct correlate of the number of volunteers in the trial. Of course, at the time that the trial is ended, you don't yet know who got sick. Did vaccinated people get sick more or less than people in the placebo, et cetera? The number of volunteers in that group, obviously, the more people that are in the group, the more confidence there is in the results of that trial. A big factor that is something that we are now aware of and thinking about a lot, but it didn't used to be true, that in clinical trials, we did not used to have a lot of diversity of volunteers, but we do now. We know that it is important. And so whether your particular subgroup was part of the clinical trials has a lot to do with whether you are going to have some confidence and sense of acceptance of the results of the clinical trial. So the usual categories of gender, race, age, comorbidities, et cetera. Obviously, the more volunteers, the greater the cost by a long shot. It's also much harder to organize and recruit people for those trials. Every trial has a data and safety management board that is responsible for monitoring the trial, making sure all the adverse events are recorded, et cetera, and for keeping the data blind until the end of the trial. And people who are administering either the vaccine or the placebo don't know what they're giving to either person. So they are blinded as well as the people who are collecting data at the end. And it's only at the very end of the trial that the information about who received the vaccine, who didn't, is unblinded. So in certain cases, data safety management boards will allow what's called an early look to see how a trial is progressing. However, those are really tricky because if you release the data too soon and there's any ambiguity in the data, you've shot yourself in the foot. You don't have the level of confidence that you could achieve by having your full statistical cohort go through the full trial without any interruptions. So just to remind us of what we had on the ground when, sorry, I should have said, that's all I'm going to talk about, the background of clinical trials. So I'm moving on to the next section. So when Wuhan revealed that it was having a very big problem with a viral-based respiratory illness and that people were dying, as you know, that was in January that the news hit us. And I reviewed in the previous talk how by January 10th, we had designed a vaccine, and that was because of work that had already been ongoing on other coronaviruses for previous epidemics and not pandemics, but epidemics. So, all right, so SARS and MERS are other coronaviruses. So there was quite a bit of work that had gone on at the National Institutes of Health in vaccine development that was ready to go for this one. We were well prepared there. And so the other part of the discussions that began in the early part of 2020 had to do with how we were going to manage all of this vaccine development and testing. We had put some of the early SARS vaccines from SARS-1 in first-in-human trials, but they hadn't progressed past there, so we really didn't know what would work in a bigger population. If it works in 20 people, it's not sufficient to roll it out, obviously, to the general population. Okay, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about why it is that I titled the talk the way I did. What is it about the HIV/AIDS community and their persistent and effective interactions with the US government that really made things possible for us, or more possible for us? So discrimination against AIDS, that's good, Irene. Discrimination against gays, we've known about, unfortunately, suffered through for a long time. The community of gay men has responded to that discrimination, and their feeling of not being understood or well treated by the medical community caused them to create gay men's clinics and community organizations to take care of themselves. When AIDS, and that's long before the AIDS crisis, when the AIDS crisis began, or exploded, I should say, they started to become more vociferous and more demanding, obviously, because they felt, observed would be a better word, that the medical community and the government was not taking the AIDS crisis seriously and was not focusing enough attention and money on making preventative therapeutics, and both prevention and therapy were being neglected. And they became very angry and voluble, and I'm sure many of you, as I do, remember pretty rambunctious demonstrations from the ACT UP community. There were some leaders within the ACT UP community who were extremely well informed and had excellent ideas about how to effect better conditions for their community. And in one particular demonstration, for instance, that they took to the grounds of the National Institutes of Health, Fauci happened to be near a window, heard them, and went down to talk with them, and became fairly impressed with their grasp of the issues and their ideas. And that became a working relationship that we benefited from, in the sense that it also meant that Fauci became more of a politically astute figure, not just a medical doctor, an infectious diseases doctor. So since the 1980s, the AIDS crisis has been pushing our public health institutions to change and to better serve the changing needs of our diverse US populations. One of the things they got was the presence of gay men on FDA panels and councils that had to do with issues affecting gay men. I'm going to talk a little bit in this slide about the efforts to make a vaccine for HIV. And I want to point out that we're not talking about AIDS therapeutics, of which we have quite a number, and people are able to live fairly good lives using those antivirals, but we still do not have a vaccine to prevent infection in people who might be exposed to the HIV virus. So that HIV is a particularly difficult virus to make an effective vaccine that could protect somebody against. It's pretty, I think it's true, this is my conjecture, but I don't think we would have the infrastructure that really saved our butts in 2020. I don't think we would have had that infrastructure if the HIV vaccine had been easy to make, because all of the networks and the connections and the personal relationships of trust that were built over the long haul, it's been 25 years, 30 years of working on those vaccines. These are people globally who know each other and trust each other and can work together. And if we hadn't had that, I don't know what would have happened with our clinical trials, given what was going on in our politics. So HIV vaccine trials began in the mid-1980s, but they were, in the early days, not very reliable or convincing. The results coming from the trials were not so clear cut. And there were a lot of sort of clear learning curves that needed to be overcome and corrected. So that's where this gentleman, Dr. Larry Corey, who is a virologist at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Institute in Seattle, he had been working on antivirals for a number of diseases, including AIDS, and he became concerned that a lot of time and effort and heart was going into trying to find a vaccine against HIV, and the efforts weren't going very well because people didn't really know what they were doing. There was a lack of coordination. And so he, among other people, founded the HIV Vaccine Trials Network, which grew over time, the HVTN. The HVTN became, through the efforts of those academics and doctors and activists globally, as well as in the United States, it became the world's largest publicly funded collaboration focused on the development of HIV and AIDS. And its primary funders are the National Institutes of Health through its subdivision of the National Institutes for Infectious Diseases and the Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So the HVTN, this trials network, went to work recruiting statisticians into its troops and improved the process of designing, implementing, and analyzing the vaccine trials for this wanted HIV vaccine. So what were their achievements? They streamlined the protocol so without losing any of the diversity of the stakeholders. They learned to incorporate and collaborate to make trials that everyone who was involved in the process felt comfortable with. They established a standardized set of assays that people could rely on to say that across various trials, say there are 5 companies, I'm making this up, but say there's 5 companies out there who are interested in developing an HIV vaccine, and every one of them is using a different assay to learn whether or not their vaccine is effective. You're going to come out with 5 different, I don't know which one's better sort of answer, even if you did have success in all 5, right? So having people agree on what constitutes a success is a big deal. They also got some very sharp biostatisticians into their organizations and set statistical standards so that people understood that there's a big difference between having a test or a trial in which you have 800 participants and a trial in which you have 8,000 participants. And just to give you some context for that, remember that Johnson & Johnson had some adverse events with their adenoviral-based vaccine for COVID-19. And there were blood clotting problems with the AstraZeneca, et cetera. Those did not show up until the vaccines were in the general population, past their emergency use authorization. It took millions of people being vaccinated before those particular complications showed up. So you can imagine, if you reel backwards in terms of powers of 10, that if you're testing your vaccine in 800 people, something doesn't show up, and then you put it out to the population, you're going to have a lot of adverse events probably showing up once you have it out in the general population. And you could have caught those and had your confidence much higher if you have a much larger clinical trial. So the last point is very important. Obviously, HIV is a global disease. It's a global problem. It is particularly rampant in Africa and Asia. And so the HVTN, the HIV Vaccine Trials Network, had built relationships with medical institutions around the world to test HIV in local populations so that we had confidence that it's not just the country that's developing the vaccine that has a good benefit from the vaccine, but rather everybody who is going to be an adopter of that vaccine also has confidence in it. So, and as I mentioned before, AIDS activists were included on the FDA committees, and they advocated for majority equity in health. They also advocated for the inclusion of faith communities, churches around the world. And that also was pushed for by those institutions within Africa and Asia. Okay, so how did the AIDS community affect the FDA? So we're probably, as I grew up with being aware of the thalidomide crisis, in which it's a sleeping pill. I think it was thalidomide was prescribed as a sleeping pill for pregnant women. And then we discovered that we had thousands of children with birth defects that were highly correlated with mothers who had been given thalidomide for sleeping. And that affected how the government, how the Congress in particular, saw that the FDA was weak in not having demanded sufficient data and testing of drugs for safety. This is the thalidomide crisis I'm just pointing to because I'm familiar with it, but if you look at the history of the FDA, there are quite a few stages at which a public health crisis or problem that had to do with regulation was addressed by the Congress, and laws were passed, and the FDA needed to step up in terms of its ability to regulate and oversee what was allowed to be out there on the medical shelves in our country. This happened again in a slightly different way. The FDA DDI, dideoxyenosine, is a compound that can be incorporated into DNA and interfere with the replication of viruses. And the AIDS community was extremely adamant in wanting access to DDI because they had nothing. They really had nothing to fight this disease. And they wanted access to DDI, and the FDA was saying, no, you can't have it. We haven't tested it enough. And the AIDS community was saying, first of all, you're not really pushing hard enough on testing this thing, and we're dying, and we really want access now. And so what is it called? I can't remember. Empathetic use, something like that, empathetic use, that when there is no other treatment under certain circumstances and you have a terminal disease, you can get access to drugs that are not already approved by the FDA. So that's another example of their work in affecting public health. So that's what I just went through. Sorry about not getting that up there. And I'm not going to go through this, but just to point out, these are some of the resources that I went to try and learn about how the history of the AIDS crisis affected changes in the FDA. But of particular interest to the COVID-19 story is their effect on diversity in trials, their demand that the FDA diversify people, make sure that companies diversify people who are included in clinical trials. And obviously the AIDS community is not, I don't want to say that they are responsible for everything that happened. I'm just trying to follow that thread. There are many organizations that have, through their shouts and murmurs, affected how our government deals with our health and what we have access to and how well it is regulated or not. Okay, so in this case, AIDS patients were on the clinical trials group, the AIDS clinical trials group, and they've been very effective in getting their inner city clinics. They already had people on the ground. Remember, I was talking about the gay men's clinics. They're generally in less socioeconomically advantaged portions of cities. They have a lot of knowledge on the ground, on the street, knowledge of inner city health groups, and they were effective in bringing that to the table. I'm going to try and read through this letter. So there's a very blurry picture of Dr. Larry Corey there on the right-hand side of this slide. He is the past director of the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Institute, as I mentioned, and was one of the founders of the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. And he's been in that capacity and prior to that also working closely with Tony Fauci and others. So he was, because of his work on HIV/AIDS, he happened to be in Washington in January 2020, early January 2020, and in a meeting that included Fauci, and they discussed the need for COVID vaccines and how was this all going to happen? How would they pull this all together. And the memo that I'm just going to read, because I like the tone of Dr. Corey's memo. There's not hysteria in it that I can detect. And from the time of January 2020, when they first talked about it, these two people, and I'm sure there were other people in the room as well, until this memo came out, March 31st, is quite a bit of time. And I think that that time is what people such as Dr. Fauci in the government needed to work through their institutional groupings to get buy-in on the idea that there was going to be a coordinated vaccine program. So here we go. So this is a memo that Dr. Corey is writing to a few of his colleagues that are part of the HIV vaccine trials network. It says, Tony asked me to try and arrange a meeting for us to coordinate a greater strategy for the COVID-19 space, especially as there is increasing interest by many pharma, as well as quite substantial biotechnology players entering this space, a nice thing to have. The goal of the discussion is to start the process of outlining an all-institute plan from establishing some cohesion regarding what types of vaccines are being developed, some thought about how to discern what's the best in class immunologically, and how to bring forward complementary strategies, and how to be able to deliver a vaccine for the US and global populace. Hence, likely multiple approaches. And of course, how the Institute, meaning the HIV Vaccine Trials Network, can facilitate this. I have asked the HVTN statisticians to start working with the VTEU, and the VTEU is the Vaccine Testing and Evaluation Units, also called the clinical research organizations, like Baylor, Emory, University of Rochester, the different ones where clinical trials would actually physically take place. And the HPTN, which is the HIV Prevention Trials Network, slightly different. So those groups also have biostatisticians within them. So they're looking for collaboration, coordination between all these groups, as well as Dean Folman in drafting a type of global master protocol for general population and a couple of special populations such as ambulatory elderly and nursing home elderly. These are protocols that will allow reasonably similar assessment of results across populations and geography. I think there is much to talk about regarding how to organize efforts better. So that is the memo that kind of started the gun off on let's get going. We have some blessing from the US government. We need to move. And that's what I'm trying to highlight here, is what was the work that this new group was going to do. Okay, so with that, how did this group, as it worked through all of these questions, how did it come down to saying, here's what we might do? Okay. So just to back up for a minute, you've noticed that the vaccines that we have all have, that we have in the United States, all have a very similar immunogen, which is the spike protein that we talked about last time. We didn't know, because we'd never run a clinical trial, whether the spike would be protective. You kind of have to put your headset back into the beginning of 2020, when we had some really good ideas, but we also were very nervous that they would not, it could be that they wouldn't pan out, right? We still didn't know much about it. So at that point in early 2020, we really didn't know very much about protective immunity. There are still huge conversations about what is protective immunity, how do you measure it, how do you know it's protective, et cetera. Early on, we had lots of stories about, well, people who have recovered from COVID-19 have these antibodies, and people who didn't recover don't have those antibodies. Those are good ideas for antibodies that might be protective and could become therapeutics, but those are not vaccines. We don't know how exactly to elicit those. So because there are so many unknowns in the room, how many agents do you want to support with money? And the group winnowed it down to, they wanted 2 mRNA vaccines, and Pfizer and Moderna were the furthest along in terms of their experience with the microencapsulation of mRNA, the stabilization of mRNA, all of those things that I put into the previous talk. The much more traditional vaccine platforms are things like adenovirus, and we had 2 different forms of adenovirus being put forward, the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson, also known as the Janssen. For this talk, I had to learn that Janssen was an independent company that Johnson & Johnson acquired, and so Janssen is Johnson & Johnson, pretty much. And there were recombinant protein, two ideas for recombinant proteins that could be put forward. All of these are focused on spike. And that's interesting, because you'll recall that the Sinopharm, the Chinese vaccine that turned out not to be so effective, is very similar to what we all had as polio vaccines. That is, it's an attenuated or killed version of the virus itself. The whole shigula is in their vaccine. And some people might have argued that that's a better approach, that when you don't really know that the spike itself is what's going to be protective or sufficiently protective, maybe you want to give it more, hedge your bets by giving it more, but that was not what they came up with. What they came up with was this idea of spike focused. Okay, so the particular big pharmas that they were choosing to work with were chosen on the basis that they had good manufacturing capabilities, that they knew how to get from A to Z without coming up against, the machinery broke or whatever along the way. They had a track record of getting vaccine products out into the market, except for Moderna, right? Moderna did not have that experience. And they were figuring 8 billion doses. That was their target, to have at least one dose for every, at this point, every adult or we didn't yet have the information about pediatrics, but as far as adults, we had at least 1 dose for every adult in the world. Excuse me. And their calculation was that those 8 billion doses could not be made even if you had every single vaccine production site in the world cranking on it now. So there's also need for putting money into budgets for creating infrastructure. So as I've said, this was an unprecedented coordinated effort. And the what they saw needed to be done in order to put some kind of protection out given that the world's economy was going into a bit of a tailspin, and there were a record number of people dying. We needed to get this done very fast, but with no glitches, no mistakes. So we needed a massively parallel rollout. So a bunch of these people, you'll see the authorship on the next slide, but they published this plan. They put together this plan, and they sent it first to the New England Journal of Medicine. New England Journal of Medicine said, we're not publishing this. I have no idea why. And I can tell you that many of you may know, it's really difficult to get yourself published in science. It's like, you know, the pinnacle of your career is when you can get published in Science or Nature or Cell, one of those three journals. And they just thought, what the hell, we'll send it to Science. And Science said yes, and they published it right away. Who knew? Anyway, so this was the publication of their plan. And here's the reference on that article. And you know, the abstract says, will require that industry, government, and academia collaborate in unprecedented ways. And then further on, we further discuss a collaborative platform for conducting harmonized, randomized, controlled vaccine efficacy trials. Everybody has to work together or this isn't going to work. This is a figure from their publication. And here you don't see 6 platforms because one of them has peeled off. There's 5 platforms, meaning mRNA, recombinant protein, adenoviral-based vaccine. That's what it's meant by platform. And then in the small print that you can't read, I'll read that to you. It says, the necessary partners in the public-private partnership are based on non-identical but harmonized efficacy trials associated with collaborating clinical trials networks and laboratories. A common, and this is really important, a common data and safety monitoring board. Remember I said those are the guys that are keeping the data, that are making sure that it's blind, that are making sure that nothing gets off track in terms of putting out the information before the maturity date of the trial. Okay, so a common, everybody's going to be using the same data and safety monitoring board, and an independent statistical group to determine the correlates of protection. What is meant by you were protected? You don't get to decide it on your own if you're XYZ company. Amazing, pretty amazing plan. So these are just a little bit of that article put through. So as I said, collaborating clinical trial sites using a common data safety monitoring board, independent statisticians, and centralized immune monitoring laboratories. So if you're going to be checking for whether or not somebody's vaccinated, you need those laboratories to be common. So here's a quote: these innovations in the process of vaccine development are required to achieve the rapid development of the platform technologies entering clinical trials. This is the justification for not everybody just running off on their own and doing their own clinical trials on their particular vaccine. And this requires global effort, global cooperation, and transparency are needed to maximize the speed, veracity, and decision-making required to deliver scientific advances to the global population in a timely fashion. And last but not least, models for all of these programs exist, and rapid implementation of these ideas is essential if we are to succeed in the timelines required to return us to pre-COVID-19 social interactions. That was the impetus. So this plan, which is called the ACTIVE plan, and ACTIVE stands for Accelerating COVID-19 Therapeutic Interventions and Vaccines, that acronym. So the ACTIVE plan that was laid out in this science publication became basically Operation Warp Speed. So a quote from the Operation Warp Speed website: leverage the full capacity of the US government to ensure that no technical, logistic, or financial hurdles hinder vaccine development or deployment, right? They don't want anything to get in the way of doing this. So their role, Operation Warp Speed, is to enable, accelerate, harmonize, and advise the companies developing the selected vaccines. And the companies execute the clinical or process development and manufacturing plans. While the Operation Warp Speed leverages, meaning gets the money, US government resources. So I'm not going to read through this one, but Francis Collins, who's the director of the National Institutes of Health, said this is only going to work if we're really on top of talking to each other regularly, which had been the practice in the AIDS vaccine group as well. So weekly meetings, and this involved all of the company representatives, National Institutes of Health, BARDA, which is a part of Health and Human Services. They're the Biomedical Advances and Research Development Authority. The Department of Defense, the Army, was very actively involved and instrumental in keeping things moving along. And of course, the FDA was involved because they needed to be making their thoughts about how these trials had to be vetted and what kind of statistics were required for a vaccine that was going to go out to such an enormous population. So I've underlined those two sections, that the FDA staff needed to hear the issues that were arising for anybody. And it was, these meetings were where people argued with each other, made changes, and came up with ideas that were acceptable to everybody. So focusing on clinical testing. So this is Operation Warp Speed in action. So obviously, in order to get these trials going, not just talk about them, but actually get them going, the size of the networks that had been built for the HIV/AIDS vaccines were insufficient to accommodate what had to be done for COVID-19. So an investigative army, they called it, of clinical test sites, clinical labs, statisticians, and virologists and vaccinologists who were involved in the process. So it was a huge, who knows who trusts who, what are we going to do to make this happen? The first part of it was to take these four entities, and that entity that's blurred out on the bottom, that's the medallion for the Department of Defense, which has a very large AIDS evaluation section. Those four AIDS, HIV-focused organizations were melded, including the DoD, into what is now called the COVID-19 Prevention Network. That network of people then got to work expanding what they had in terms of resources. So the graph that's below starts on the left-hand side in June and ends at the end of October. And the upper line is the number of clinical research sites available for this COVID-19 vaccine testing rollout. And it's heavily concentrated in the United States, but it also has significantly a large number of global sites. So the number of sites globally started in June with the ones that had been in force with HIV AIDS at 60, and that rose to almost 80. That's not a huge increase, but significant. The number of sites in the United States rose more dramatically from 62 to 152 clinical research sites. So this is just a prettier slide of what were the agents that were being sent to these sites that were within the Operation Warp Speed. You'll remember that Pfizer chose not to be part of Operation Warp Speed. However, we paid a lot of money to Janssen to build new manufacturing sites for their vaccine. And also they got huge support from the US government as part of that program that was rolled out by Operation Warp Speed, in which millions and usually millions, 100 million to 300 million doses of a vaccine were purchased before we even knew if that vaccine worked, right? We were really wanting to make sure that things were not stopped just because people didn't have money to make this happen. Okay, so on this list, we have Moderna, AstraZeneca, Janssen, which is Johnson & Johnson, and Novavax, which is limping along at this point, but that is the recombinant protein and adjuvant protocol, as opposed to mRNA or adenovirus, a different type of vaccine. All right, so this is a slide that I got from Dr. Corey, and this is his point of view that in May of 2020, through the acceleration of COVID-19 vaccines group, it was a bit like forcing independent companies to fit into the program. So he starts by describing the interactions with Pfizer, and these were repeated interactions with each of the companies involved. They had approached Pfizer in March and April of 2020, even before the finalized plan was going. And Pfizer had said they didn't want to work with the government, that the National Institutes of Health was too slow. They weren't going to be slowed down by that. And Pfizer's plan was to have a vaccine trial much bigger than they did for other vaccines, but they thought 8,000 people would be enough, and that's what they wanted to go with. The third line is talking about the fact that Dr. Corey and one of his biostatisticians were presenting in April that they were convinced that it would take at least 30,000 people per trial to make the statistics be convincing enough that people around the world would accept these vaccines as either effective or not effective, but at least we would know what percent efficacy they had, and we could trust that number. So that was in April that they were arguing 30,000 people. In June, Pfizer changes its mind from 8,000 people, apparently being convinced by the plan that the group from the HVTN had put out, and they had a 28,000 person trial. And then at the same time, the group is also working very hard with the news outlets. As Dr. Corey said in his talk, you couldn't sneeze without the news outlets reporting it. So the Washington Post and the New York Times and this and that. And so there were a lot of articles coming out and pointing to the fact that the socioeconomically disadvantaged groups in our country were dying at a much higher rate than people who were better off. And that was mostly the white population that was better off. So there was a large need to have BIPOC communities represented in the clinical trials. And at that point, that public pressure, so to speak, convinced Pfizer that they needed to pay for more testing in other communities and globally. And so they added the nation of Colombia, a testing site in Colombia, to their protocols. Now they had 43,000 people in their trial. They also, at this point, realized that the groups that were derived from the HIV/AIDS networks were much better prepared at getting these trials going, and that their registries were much better managed even than Pfizer had access to. And so they petitioned the AIDS-derived groups for access to those registries, that they be able to recruit volunteers from those registries as well. Anyway, they started their Pfizer started their trial in July, and Dr. Corey's comment is that they had learned a lot from the Coronavirus Protection Network, HIV-derived network, and they executed their studies beautifully, and they have done a great job in the pediatric vaccine program, as we now know. I'm not going to go over this slide, but I just was interested that when I looked on the Pfizer website about how they saw their role in blah, 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 they have this kind of nebulous comment. They don't mention who they were learning from. They just say, we worked closely with regulatory agencies, providing near real-time data and receiving review and advice more quickly than ever before. That's their nod. But in fact, it's the FDA, the NIAID, the CoVPM, et cetera. But Pfizer isn't saying exactly who. So let's turn back to Moderna, the other company that had mRNA vaccines. How did this rapid fire process of getting the vaccines out, how did the sort of way of thinking and approaching clinical trials that the HIV/AIDS community had worked through in 25, 30 years, how did it affect Moderna? So you may recall from my previous talk that Moderna had been working closely with the NIH on SARS and MERS, which is exactly how they became kind of the company that NIH was knew well, their microencapsulation nanoparticle formulation of vaccines, and the NIH had been testing those in animals for quite a number of years with Kazikia Corbett in the head of that group. I'm going to leave aside this thorny patent issue, but I'm sure many of you know that Moderna filed for a patent and specifically excluded the NIH scientists. It's a pretty nasty mark, I think, on their reputation. Okay, so how about Moderna from Dr. Corey's point of view? Well, he called them a fitful adolescent. He didn't mince words in this talk. They'd never obviously done an efficacy trial. They were a relatively young, cowboyish company. They thought they could do a trial with 5,000 people and it would be white-centric, one in Europe and one in the United States. So Dr. Corey says that his organization was kind of forced on them, and they were, because they really needed the help of the US government, the Operation Warp Speed, but they were initially quote, unenthusiastic about being told what to do, as most teenagers are. I was. but they did finally embrace, as Pfizer had, the idea that you really did need 30,000 people in your trial. They initially had no interest in international sites. And look at all the money they're making off of international sales. Okay, but anyway, back to the story. They weren't interested in international sites, and they didn't have any interest in BIPOC communities. They didn't think that was important. So I'm going backwards a little bit here. In the HIV/AIDS community, they were very aware that they needed to if an HIV vaccine was going to make it and be accepted, that they had to be working with the affected communities, and that included strongly BIPOC communities and faith-based communities. And those sentiments, knowledge, connections, et cetera, were brought into the coronavirus protection network at a portion of Operation Warp Speed. So the pictured here are some of the faith-based people on the left, the two, Stephen Walker and Michelle Andrasik. Sally Bach, who's in the middle there, is a marketing expert who she'll come up in the next slide. But these are some of the people that were strongly engaged in pivoting their work in order to focus on the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. There was a rollout of a large campaign, expert panels. I think I showed some of them in my previous talk that the NAACP had put on, and some of the faith-based communities. So they had a program called COVID in Black. They had a very strong faith initiative. And by the way, local knowledge, it turns out that one of the seven faith ministers in the HIV/AIDS community is here in Richmond. Dr. Hassan has a church, Pentecostal church. And anyway, so on to the next thing. So this is Sally Bach's community. She got lots of kudos from Dr. Corey in his talk. She was extremely effective marketing specialist, and he had never worked with marketing specialists before. And he said, that's the honey in the pie. It's really good, the marketing specialist. In terms of knowing how to message to vulnerable communities to recruit clinical volunteers from those communities. And as you'll see from this slide, at that point, they thought they needed 125,000 volunteers. It was closer to 150,000 volunteers, an enormous effort. These are two of the people that I mentioned from the faith community. They had campaigns that were Saturday mornings where they would Zoom in Francis Collins and Tony Fauci to talk at community meetings. They were enrolling people on a regular basis and worked very hard until all the trials had enough data to demonstrate efficacy, specifically in BIPOC communities. So as I said, CoVPN, they figured they needed 125,000. It was closer to 150,000 by the time things really got rolling to get those 5 vaccine candidates through trials. And obviously a volunteer couldn't be in 2 trials at once. So if you had 30 to 40,000 in each trial and five trials. The registry that was organized and rolled out based on the HIV registry included the location, comorbidities, race and ethnic group, gender, socioeconomic factors, high risk assessment. It was a very, very well described database that has been created. And through all of the efforts in outreach and marketing, they overshot their target, and that registry now has 650,000 volunteers who are educated and ready to go for vaccine trials. It's really a stunning a stunning feat. Okay, so what was the effect of all of this talk about BIPOC communities, minority communities being involved in the clinical trials? Here I have the two graphs, too complicated for one slide. I'm going to break it down in the next one. So what I want you to pay attention to are the columns on the left. And here is that first slide, the one from the left from August of 2020. There's insufficient diversity in this the demographics covered in the Moderna trials. The 4 columns, by the way, are the different clinical research organizations that are masterminding or keeping track of all of the participants in the trials. So that's what those 4 columns are. And this is only focused on the United States right now. And you can see that the moving left to right, that the greatest volume of population in the volunteer groups are white people and not Hispanic, or the Hispanic or Latino is the light blue, and then Black is the yellow, and then there's Asian, American Indian, and Alaska Native, and Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and other are the other subcategories. So these columns represent the diversity was insufficient to match, and that was the goal, match the diversity of the United States in 2020. And this is what they got to by October in terms of enrollment in the Moderna trials. And you can see that the proportion of just white has gone down in relation to Hispanic and Latino and Black in particular. So it was successful in terms of recruiting volunteers into those groups. I'm going to have to speed up in terms of my timing. I apologize, I've been going on too long. But I'm going to move quickly through these next slides. So the red line over here is the number of events. That is the number of people that got were diagnosed with COVID-19 that were volunteers in the trials. And you can see that that red line is rising faster than what the biostatisticians at the beginning of the clinical trials had expected it to rise. And they were basing their projections based on what we knew about the Wuhan virus, which was obviously very little back in March of 2020 in terms of R0s and how transmissible viruses were or could become. So the Moderna trials were moving a little bit faster than expected. I'm going to skip that slide. Okay, so just to review, what did we have in place when this whole pandemic started in January 2020? We had 20 years supporting mRNA as a vaccine. We had 20 years in the structural biology of viral envelopes, and what I went over last time about the pre-fusion structure of the spike and why that is so much more effective as a vaccine. We knew that. We had already done some preclinical animal models and a little bit of first in human with SARS, MERS, and Zika based in similar platforms. And we had 20 years of the HIV virus testing network and the clinical research organizations that could get us through. Okay, so that's just a summary slide that HVTN, the late 1990s, they only had 8 clinical sites in the US and 1 in Brazil. They were building their structure by 2020 when the COVID-19 first started. They had 72 clinical sites, et cetera, and a whole network of people. And I think of it as when 2020 hit, thank God we had the network of fiber optics to support our Zoom meetings. If we hadn't had that, we would have been a lot worse off. Similarly, in the case of the vaccine, if we hadn't had those networks to build on and expand, we would have been a lot worse off. Okay, so meanwhile, as these clinical trials are chugging along, we come to the snappy story of there were tensions in the country, a lot of misinformation, a lot of disinformation, and here we are. So we had a huge, depending on your point of view, we had an influence in the world of vaccine trials and acceptance and people believing that this vaccine would be protective was highly influenced by the politics of the moment. And I love this photograph. So as Dr. Corey said, it was the big elephant in the room as they were working on feverishly on all of these clinical trials and getting buy-in and working through with the FDA, how would these trials be reviewed? What would be sufficient? What did the FDA need? All of those things. And the FDA had not done an emergency use authorization before, so a lot had to be worked out. Okay, so here's the politics. So we had Dr. Corey's words again, quote, how do we make sure the election doesn't abort the process and initiate an early release of data? That is, that Trump administration wanted the credit. Nobody knew yet whether these vaccines worked or yet, right? You don't learn if the vaccine is effective until it gets unblinded at the end of the clinical trial. And the administration wanted very badly for the data safety and management boards to look at the data, to unblind them, to learn whether or not they were effective before the election so that it would affect the election. And so the medical and scientific communities were really worried that the integrity of the trial would be compromised because of elections. So we have all of these characters that I've listed who were part of the scene. So as I said, the data is under the control of the data safety and management boards. Moderna's data safety management board, because they were part of the concerted effort under Operation Warp Speed, was in the control of the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Fauci's subdivision, the infectious diseases subdivision. But Pfizer had its own data safety management board, and they could be influenced. So the question was, would Pfizer want, for various reasons, to look at a lower number of endpoints? That is, instead of waiting for 150 or 200 people to be declared diagnostically COVID-19 positive, they would look at 40 people when they had sufficient number of cases. They would take an early look. So what was going to happen? And it was also not known how much safety follow-up would be required. That after the end of the clinical trial, there's usually 6 to 8 months of safety data to see what are the long-term effects of a vaccine before you allow lots of people to have it. So the problem was that the integrity of the medical investigative community was forever at risk. We know what happened with hydroxychloroquine, that Stephen Hahn was influenced by the Trump administration to allow hydroxychloroquine to be used. And it turned out to be, in some cases, fatal. It was it was not effective, and it was really deleterious. And so some trust in the FDA was lost there. So at this point, with the amount of pressure from the White House, those people who were working on these vaccine trials, Dr. Corey said there were lots of sleepless nights, lots of secretive phone calls between people, discussions about what's our role here, what's our role as physicians, what's our role as investigators, what are our roles as citizens of the United States, what do we do? Okay, so that's just to remind you that things were moving faster than originally thought. So in order to protect the integrity of the vaccine clinical trials, this is what people working on them were doing to try and stem off the pressure from the political sphere. They started mounting a lot of public symposia. They had a lot of people who were academics who were extremely sympathetic, and they started giving public symposia and writing articles and getting publications on the importance of keeping the trials blinded until the pre-agreed upon number of cases was reached. The academics, the public health people, everybody who was interested, working, especially the statistician, working with companies such as Moderna to realize that an early release would undercut public trust and work against their long-term interests of trust in their vaccine. And as I mentioned before, the FDA had not yet decided how long a safety duration time they would require. And usually it's 6 months. So this is just an example of one of the public symposia that was put together. They have a cast of medical and research stars on this long list on the right there, the 2 columns of speakers presenting to the public what was the science behind the vaccine efficacy trials, what were the essential elements, what were the frameworks, and what the FDA's conversations were about emergency use authorization, what were the ethical aspects of these trials, and et cetera, et cetera. And out of those public symposia and comments by academics, letters being written, et cetera, the whole campaign, here's an early title from the Wall Street Journal, a publication in which Moderna's CEO was saying, oh, you know what, we're going to be ready by late October, right? And this is the response, and Pfizer also came out with headlines. I forget whether this was the Post or the New York Times, but that they would have something in October. So the race is on, right, to be the first out of the box and blah, blah, blah. And here is Dr. Eric Topol, who's a well-known pundit, expert on vaccine trials, and he was quoted in the New York Times in September. He was part of the campaign to not get things aborted too quickly. And he also criticizes in that same article that Pfizer was allowing mild cases of COVID, milder than what was required in Moderna's, to be counted as part of their events of illness. And that would mean that their trial would go faster because they were including things that didn't even require hospitalization. So this whole issue of, are you counting everybody that gets a sniffle, which is 99% of the people, or are you looking really for a vaccine that prevents hospitalization and death? What are you really looking for? So October 6, 2020, Peter Marks, who is one of the head biostatisticians in the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research within the FDA. So he's the relevant biostatistician, and he is saying that the FDA will be comfortable with 2 months of follow-up work, which means that after the end of the clinical trial, before people could get vaccinated, would be another 2 months. So at least we had a definition of that. And then with a lot of work from academics, public people, public health experts, et cetera, pushing and pushing and pushing on Moderna and Pfizer, these two headlines came out later in October. And Moderna says will be done in November. And Pfizer says it won't seek vaccine authorization before mid-November. So at the same time, to increase public trust, Moderna and Pfizer agreed with each other and others that they would reveal all of their blueprints for the trials, not how to make the vaccine, but how they're running the trials, what's going on, who's included, who's not, et cetera, et cetera. And this statement in September that 9 drug companies talking about supporting it also. And Trump reacted to that, that the tightening of the COVID vaccine guidelines was a political move, which, well, depends on how you look at it. But here's what actually happened, right? The presidential election was the 3rd of November. The Pfizer and Moderna came out with interim data safety after the election, and then the EUAs came out in December. So that's it. Lessons learned from this experience, in the words of Dr. Corey, that coalitions are what it takes to get these things done. Academic, government, and industry. Everyone has equal skin in the game and motivation to succeed, which makes for common purpose. A key ingredient to success of the country is involving the citizenry, an important statement, which we're having a lot of trouble with these days, obviously. He says, mountains can be moved when you work differently and you don't leave things sitting on people's desks, moving along at a cadence. He said the Department of Defense was very effective in these clinical trials, in making people deliver on time. He was very impressed with the marketing that was done to get people into the clinical trials, and that the willingness and ability of the US government to fund these endeavors was important. And it was, and that the research could be scaled and the involvement of the minority communities can be achieved. So the sources for my talk are the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Fred Hutch Cancer Research Center website, and the keynote presentation given by Dr. Corey in November at the oncolytic virus meetings. And that's it. I get to stop share. Oh, that's just, if you go to the website, you can learn more about Dr. Corey. All right, I'm going to stop share and see if there are questions. I've gone over time. I apologize.
Well, first, I would just like to thank you, Irene. One thing that I'm taking away from this is we often say things like, what are they going to do? When are they going to come out with some kind of a vaccine? And what I've learned from this is who the they are. And it's a lot of people.
It's a ton. Yeah.
Yes, and your presentation has, informed me on that. It is such a big number. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask Hillary maybe to go through the list of questions that might have come through.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Irene. That's great. Roger had a couple of questions. Go ahead, Roger.
Oh, earlier in your talk, you used the word global, and I didn't know what global meant, because my impression was that the U.S. effort was somewhat coordinated with Europeans, but not very much with Russians and Chinese and people in India. So that was one of my questions. If you use the word global, you didn't really mean everybody in the world, I guess.
Not at all. No.
Oh.
So it's a good question and a good refinement of the word global. So the Chinese were not interested in working with anybody but the Chinese, the Russians the same. And in fact, the reports that I've read about the Russian efforts, it was really a mixed bag about whether they were going to get much support. And in the end, they were not able to convince more than about half of their population, even in cities, to get vaccinated because there wasn't much trust of the vaccines. Anyway, so the original international testing sites, Brazil, South Africa, Venezuela, et cetera, those were connections that had been made for HIV/AIDS and expanded upon. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I don't have a list of what the additional, I think it was about 19 sites that were brought on beyond what HIV/AIDS had when they came in January 2020. I don't know exactly where those were. Yeah.
So would you say that the Russian and the Chinese vaccines are equally effective to the American ones?
I don't think they've been tested the way that ours were tested. And I should say ours is, I mean, Pfizer is a European, right? BioNTech right. is a German company, Pfizer right. similarly. So, and I used to work for 23 years for a German pharmaceutical company. So anyway, the experience with the Chinese vaccine is that it's not very effective, that colleges went through a lot of trouble with international students coming who had been vaccinated with the Chinese vaccine and they needed to be revaccinated, et cetera. So I'm not sure I can give you much more than that, but yeah.
Okay. Right. So the other question that I had was, do you think that Donald Trump deserves any credit for Operation Warp Speed?
Yes, I do. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I don't know specifically. So one of the fascinating books I read, and I can't remember if I mentioned this last time, was Michael Lewis's book, The Premonition. It's a really interesting look at the origins of the pandemic, and then he does an excellent history of public health and where things come from. Anyway, so I don't know who pulled the levers. I don't know within the Trump administration, but the fact, number one, that he didn't stop it, he never endorsed it. He never said, "Oh, this is great. We love vaccines." No, he was supporting misinformation and disinformation. But the fact that he didn't stop it is a big deal. And I personally think it's because he's a businessman and he sees this as, well, we could make a lot of money off of vaccines. I don't know.
No. But I thought it was quite striking during the campaign and even before that here was this amazing effort, but Trump never seemed to take the credit. I always thought, well, why doesn't he step up and say, you know what, I put all this money, and he could have. I mean, obviously it's not just him, but he could have, and he didn't. And is that because of his base doesn't trust vaccines, or? I
don't know.
Yeah, that's a political question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's just a whole mystery to me.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks. Mark has a question.
Yeah, my question has to do with the trials itself. That it seems like it might be very difficult to totally blind these trials because many people do get an adverse reaction to being vaccinated, like some flu or high temperature or whatnot. And obviously, I don't know if the placebos were designed to elicit that same response or not.
You know, I thought about that too, and I don't have an answer for it. I didn't react that much to my 2 vaccines, but I got my booster and I was up all night with fever and chills. And I thought, how could this be blinded? So I had the same question. I don't have an answer for you. I think it would be not ethical to put a different vaccine in. Like a lot of people react to the flu vaccines, right? So maybe you could give flu vaccines to half the people and COVID-19 to the other. I don't know, but yeah, I don't know. Good question.
I had a question, maybe a bit of speculation about COVID in Africa, because from what I've read, well, we know that very few people in Africa have been vaccinated. What is it, 2% or something like that? And yet they're not experiencing the huge waves of infections we're seeing in Europe and the US.
Right.
Any speculation about that and what that means for future vaccinations in Africa?
So, okay, so I worked a little bit with a wonderful organization started by 7 different women who were epidemiologists, et cetera, called Get One, Give One, which was a campaign to get vaccines sent to low-income countries and primarily Africa, where they each had connections, et cetera, et cetera. And what I learned from that partly was that a lot of the governments don't want to have anything to do with the vaccines. They don't have the money, they don't have the resources, they're not supportive of them. And so the word on the street is not, oh, I want a vaccine, right? So I don't know that African countries, other countries are going to want the vaccine. I don't know that, even if it's delivered to them. I was hearing that often shipments go and they just sit there in the warehouse. And maybe the government is thinking, oh, I can sell it for money. Who knows? I don't know. But the epidemiology of this pandemic is way beyond my ken. But I do know that there were some really interesting articles written in the New Yorker early on. I think Mukherjee wrote one about India and the fact that India is so packed with people and yet it wasn't getting a lot of COVID. And then a few months later, whammo, it hit. Right now, in a kind of similar parallel story, there's a March 9th, I think it was, maybe in the Atlantic, that I have a graph I could pick up, but basically a comparison of Hong Kong and South Korea, both of which are being hit very, very hard with a lot of hospitalization and deaths. Both of them were countries that were in lockdown, and so they don't have a lot of herd immunity. And the vaccine uptake, the vaccines available are not that protective. And so both those countries, by not having built up much herd immunity, really getting whacked now. So I don't know what's going to happen with Africa. People are concerned. People are obviously watching it. What's going to happen? I was really interested maybe 9-10 months ago. There was a thought that some of the public health measures for various parasites were tamping down the ability of this particular virus to spread within the population. We still don't know. We don't know. Have we run out of questions?
A quick question, if I may, about herd immunity. So where are we in, say, California or in the US as far as that? Because everybody we know has gotten vaccinated, boosted, contemplating getting another booster, but parts of the country haven't. And we're seeing that there are still cases turning up in fairly big numbers. So is there herd immunity really, or?
So as far as I can tell, and again, I'm not a herd immunity person, but I'll take a stab at it, which is that the the epidemiologists that I've been hearing from periodically haven't come up with oh yeah, at this level of herd immunity we'll be in good shape, because there's so much that goes into it. The drop off in protection post-vaccine, post-shot, past jab, right? That seems to be dropping off faster now. There was a big article that came out from Israel 2-3 weeks ago, I think, showing that they only got 2 to 3 months of protection after a booster. And
oh, wow.
We had been predicting at least 6 months, but we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. Yeah.
Are you in favor of the extra booster? Personally?
I'm going to go get one before I start traveling. And I heard from Hillary, she's off to England. I say, get a booster.
I got one.
She got hers already. I have friends that are like calculating, okay, 2 weeks before I go, I'm going to go get that booster. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Your enthusiasm and your energy and your excellent way of explaining. I mean, this isn't my area, but I really felt like I didn't fall behind. Thank you.
I appreciate that comment very much, because I have to tell you, when I heard Larry Corey talk, I was like, wow, I have to learn how to tell this story, because this is cool.
Well, you did a great job.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I still have it in my beanie that mRNA vaccines for cancer, et cetera, I will try and pull that together, and maybe early fall or something, I'll see you guys all again.
Okay,
Awesome.
thank you, Irene. I'm writing that down all our winter. And that, you know, it's been really nice for you to come. You're always welcome to come and talk on any subject, because we know it's going to be interesting. And again, thank you in the name of Ashby Village and all of our members very much.
Thank you all for coming and listening. I really appreciate it. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.